Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt like something was off? Today, we're diving into a mystery that's haunted collectors and historians for decades, a seemingly innocent wedding portrait from 1910 that hides a dark secret in plain sight. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to mention something exciting. I'm developing another channel where I explore even more mysteries like this one. If you love this type of content, you'll definitely want to check it out. The link is in the description below. Now let's step back in time to 1910 Pennsylvania, where a photograph captured more than just a moment. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Morrison's estate sales in Philadelphia, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the chaos inside. Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old antique dealer specializing in Victorian and Edwardian memorabilia, methodically worked her way through boxes of items from the recently deceased Margaret Holloway's estate. The elderly woman had lived alone in a Germantown row house for nearly 60 years, and her possessions told the story of a life lived in the shadows of the past. Sarah's fingers were dusty and cold as she carefully lifted leather-bound albums and loose photographs from a cedar chest that smelled of mothballs and forgotten years. She'd been doing this work for 12 years, ever since leaving her corporate job in Boston, and she'd developed an instinct for spotting items of value, not just monetary, but historical. Most dealers rushed through estate sales looking for obvious treasures. Sarah looked for stories. It was nearly 5 o'clock when she found it, tucked between the pages of a 1909 Sears catalogue. The photograph was smaller than she expected, roughly 4 by 6 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing that had yellowed with age. The studio mark on the bottom read, "Whitmore & Sons Photography, Scranton, PA, 1910, in ornate gold lettering." The couple in the photograph appeared to be in their mid-20s. The woman wore a high-necked white blouse with intricate lace detailing. Her dark hair swept up in the Gibson girl style popular at the time. Her expression was serene, almost melancholic, with eyes that seemed to look past the camera into some distant point. The man stood slightly behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder in the traditional pose of the era. He was handsome in a severe way, with sharp features and dark eyes that held an intensity unusual for photographs of that period, when subjects typically maintained neutral expressions due to long exposure times. But it was what hung around the man's neck that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. A thick silver chain, clearly visible against his dark suit jacket, held what appeared to be a locket or pendant. Even in the sepia-toned photograph, she could see the intricate detail of the piece. But there was something else. The locket appeared to contain a small photograph or image within it, and from what Sarah could discern in the fading afternoon light, it looked like another face, a woman's face, but it wasn't the woman standing beside him. Sarah pulled out her jeweler's loupe and examined the photograph more closely. The detail was remarkable for its age. The necklace was definitely silver, possibly with gold inlay, and the craftsmanship suggested it was expensive. But the image within the pendant was what troubled her. Even with magnification, she couldn't quite make out the features clearly, but it was unmistakably a different woman, younger, with lighter hair. She flipped the photograph over. On the back, written in faded brown ink in a careful feminine hand, were the words, "Thomas and Catherine Whitmore, May 15th, 1910. May God forgive us all." The phrase sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It wasn't unusual for old photographs to have inscriptions, but the tone of this one was ominous. May God forgive us all suggested guilt, shame, or tragedy, emotions that seemed at odds with what should have been a happy occasion. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her concentration. It was Marcus, her business partner and ex-husband, reminding her that the estate sale would close in 20 minutes. She glanced around the dimly lit room, at the mountains of belongings that had constituted Margaret Holloway's life, and made a decision. She would buy the entire contents of the cedar chest. Something about this photograph demanded investigation. As she carried the chest to the checkout counter, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She turned back toward the room where she'd found the photograph, but saw only shadows cast by the flickering overhead lights. The rain had intensified, and through the windows she could see the streets of Germantown growing dark beneath heavy clouds. The clerk, a bored-looking young man with headphones around his neck, barely glanced at the chest before quoting her a price. Sarah paid in cash, loaded the chest into her van, and drove home through the downpour, the photograph sitting on the passenger seat beside her. That night, in her apartment above her shop in Old City, Philadelphia, Sarah spread the contents of the chest across her dining room table. There were dozens of photographs, some dating back to the 1890s, along with letters, obituaries clipped from newspapers, and several journals with entries spanning from 1908 to 1915. But she kept returning to the photograph of Thomas and Catherine Whitmore. If you're enjoying this story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me continue bringing you these mysteries. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania before it opened. The building on Locust Street stood solid and imposing, its stone facade darkened by more than a century of city pollution. She'd called ahead and arranged to meet with Dr. Robert Martinez, a researcher who specialized in early 20th century Pennsylvania history and whom she'd worked with on previous projects. Dr. Martinez was waiting in the research room, a space lined with filing cabinets and shelves holding bound volumes of newspapers and city records. He was in his early 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses perpetually perched on top of his head. When Sarah showed him the photograph, his expression shifted from casual interest to focused attention. "Whitmore," he said, studying the studio mark. "I know that name. Give me a moment." He disappeared into the stacks and returned 15 minutes later with a leather-bound volume and several folders. The Whitmores were a prominent family in Scranton. Mining money. Thomas Whitmore Jr. married Catherine Brennan in April 1910. This photograph was likely taken shortly after their wedding. Sarah felt a surge of excitement. "Tell me everything you know about them, Doctor." Martinez opened one of the folders, revealing newspaper clippings from the Scranton Times. Thomas Jr. was the son of Thomas Whitmore Sr., who owned several coal mines in the region. By all accounts, Thomas Jr. was being groomed to take over the family business. Catherine Brennan came from a less prominent family. Her father managed one of the Whitmore mines. The marriage was seen as somewhat unusual for the time, given the class difference. He pulled out another clipping, this one with a photograph. "This is from their wedding announcement. See here, Catherine looks almost exactly as she does in your photograph. But notice anything different about Thomas?" Sarah leaned in. In the newspaper photograph, Thomas wore a simple collar and tie with no visible jewelry. "No necklace," she said. "Exactly. Men of that era, particularly those from wealthy families, rarely wore necklaces. It was considered somewhat effeminate or bohemian." Dr. Martinez adjusted his glasses and examined the photograph more closely. "The fact that he's wearing it in what appears to be a formal portrait is unusual. May I?" Sarah handed him her loupe. He studied the pendant for several minutes, his expression growing more troubled. "That's not a locket," he said finally. "It's a memorial pendant. They were popular in the Victorian era. People would place photographs of deceased loved ones inside them, often incorporating hair or other personal items. But by 1910, the practice was falling out of fashion, especially among men. So the woman in the pendant," Sarah began, "is likely someone who died, someone important to Thomas." Dr. Martinez set down the loupe and pulled out another file. "Here's where it gets interesting. I remembered the Whitmore name because there was a scandal associated with the family. Let me find... Yes, here it is." He laid out a newspaper clipping from March 1909, more than a year before the wedding. The headline read, "Local woman dies in tragic accident. Whitmore family in mourning." Sarah read the article with growing unease. Eleanor Hartwell, age 22, had died after falling from a second-story window at the Whitmore family estate during a social gathering. According to the article, Miss Hartwell had been a close friend of the family and was engaged to Thomas Whitmore Jr. The death was ruled accidental, though the article noted that witnesses reported hearing raised voices shortly before the fall. So Thomas's fiancée died a year before he married Catherine, Sarah said, processing the information. And he's wearing her photograph around his neck in his wedding portrait, or what appears to be her photograph. Without seeing the pendant directly, we can't be certain. Dr. Martinez pulled up something on his computer. I'm checking our obituary records. Yes, here's Eleanor Hartwell's death notice. Funeral was held at St. Michael's Church in Scranton, buried at Forest Hill Cemetery. Sarah took notes furiously. What else can you tell me about the circumstances of her death? Dr. Martinez scrolled through several documents. Not much in the official records. The death was investigated by the local police, but the file was closed quickly. The Whitmores were influential. They likely had the power to ensure things were handled quietly. He paused. However, there were rumors. I came across them years ago when researching labor disputes in the mining industry. What kind of rumors? That Eleanor Hartwell didn't fall, that she jumped or was pushed, and that Thomas Whitmore Jr. knew more about her death than he ever admitted. Dr. Martinez closed the folder. Of course, these are just rumors. Nothing was ever proven. Sarah stared at the photograph, at Thomas's intense eyes and the pendant around his neck. What happened to Thomas and Catherine after they married? Dr. Martinez's expression darkened. That's the tragic part. Catherine died in childbirth in November 1910, just 6 months after their wedding. The child survived, a daughter named Margaret. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Margaret? As in Margaret Holloway, whose estate I bought this from. Could be. It's a common name, but the timing would be right. If the daughter was born in 1910, she would have been 115 years old this year. Margaret Holloway was in her 90s when she died, so the ages don't quite match. He checked his notes. Actually, wait. Let me verify the birth year. As Dr. Martinez searched through records, Sarah's mind raced. The inscription on the back of the photograph, "May God forgive us all." Had Catherine known about Thomas's connection to Eleanor's death? Had she known he was wearing Eleanor's photograph at their wedding? And why would their daughter keep this photograph for her entire life? Here it is, Dr. Martinez said. Margaret Whitmore, born November 3rd, 1910, mother Catherine Whitmore, deceased in childbirth, father Thomas Whitmore Jr. After Catherine's death, Thomas sent the child to be raised by Catherine's sister in Philadelphia. He himself died in 1915 at age 30. The death certificate lists the cause as suicide. The room suddenly felt colder. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. Suicide? He shot himself in the study of the family home. No note was found, but according to reports, he'd been drinking heavily and showing signs of severe depression for years. Dr. Martinez collected the documents into a neat pile. It's a tragic story, but not an uncommon one for that era. Industrial accidents, childbirth complications, mental health issues, all were devastatingly common. But Sarah couldn't stop staring at the photograph, at the pendant around Thomas's neck, at Catherine's sad eyes, at the inscription on the back. Something terrible had happened in 1909 when Eleanor Hartwell fell from that window, and somehow this photograph held a piece of that truth. Sarah spent the next 2 weeks immersed in research. She traveled to Scranton, a city whose glory days in the coal industry had long passed, leaving behind a landscape of abandoned mines and fading Victorian mansions. The Whitmore estate still stood on North Washington Avenue, though it had been converted into luxury apartments decades ago. She stood outside in the November cold, staring up at the second-story windows, trying to imagine Eleanor Hartwell's final moments. The current building manager, a skeptical man named Gerald, who'd worked there for 30 years, agreed to show her around after Sarah explained she was researching the building's history. The interior had been completely renovated, with modern fixtures and open-plan living spaces bearing no resemblance to the original layout. But Gerald led her to what had once been the main drawing room. "This is where the fancy parties would have been," he said, gesturing around the space that was now divided into two apartments. "My grandmother used to work here as a maid back in the 20s. She told me stories about the Whitmores, said the family was cursed." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Cursed how?" Gerald shrugged. "You know how old folks talk. Said bad things happened to anyone who got close to the family. The fiancé who fell, the wife who died having a baby, Thomas himself putting a gun to his head. My grandmother said she could hear someone crying in the halls late at night, even years after they were all dead." "Did she say who was crying?" "She thought it was Thomas. Said he wandered the house at night, drunk and talking to himself, talking to someone named Eleanor, asking for forgiveness." Gerald checked his watch. "Look, I've got to get back to work. You need anything else?" Sarah thanked him and left, but not before photographing the exterior and documenting measurements of the windows. Back at her hotel, she pulled out the journal she'd found in Margaret Holloway's chest. She'd been reading through them chronologically, but most entries were mundane: shopping lists, appointments, brief observations about weather. But there was one journal, dated 1962, that contained longer, more personal entries. Margaret had been 52 years old when she wrote them, living alone in the Philadelphia row house where she would spend the rest of her life. The entries talked about dreams, recurring nightmares that had plagued her since childhood. In one particularly detailed entry from October 1962, Margaret described a dream where she was standing in a large room filled with well-dressed people. A woman in a white dress stood by a window, and a man with dark eyes, her father, though she'd never known him, wore a silver necklace with a face trapped inside it. The face was screaming. Sarah felt her skin prickle as she read. Margaret had never known her father. He died when she was only 5. How could she dream about him in such specific detail? About the necklace? The entry continued. "I woke up crying, as I always do after this dream. Mrs. Patterson next door asked if I was all right. I told her it was just a nightmare, but it feels like more than that. It feels like a memory, though I know that's impossible. I was only 6 months old when Mother died. I never saw Father wearing that necklace. I never saw him at all after I was sent to live with Aunt Helen. And yet I see him so clearly in my dreams, standing in that room, his hand on Mother's shoulder, and that terrible necklace around his neck with a face inside it. A young woman's face, beautiful and dead." Sarah set down the journal and picked up the photograph again. Using her phone's flashlight and her strongest loupe, she examined every detail of the pendant. The image inside was deteriorated and difficult to make out, but she could see enough to confirm what she'd suspected. It was definitely a photograph of a young woman with light hair, her expression frozen in what might have been a smile, or might have been something else entirely. "Leave your comment about what you think of this story so far." She contacted a colleague who specialized in antique jewelry and sent him detailed photographs of the necklace. 2 days later, he called her back with his assessment. "It's definitely a memorial pendant," he confirmed, "probably made by a specialty jeweler in New York or Philadelphia. The craftsmanship is excellent, silver with gold inlay, likely worth several $100s at the time, which would be thousands today. But here's what's unusual. The photograph inside appears to have been taken post-mortem." Sarah's stomach turned. "What?" It was a common practice in the Victorian era and into the early 1900s. Families would photograph deceased loved ones, sometimes posed as if sleeping, sometimes with eyes painted open on the photograph to make them appear alive. This image shows signs of that kind of post-mortem photography. The lighting is flat, the pose is unnaturally still, and if you look very closely, he paused. Well, the eyes don't look quite right. There's a painted quality to them. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her apartment's growing darkness, the photograph in front of her. Thomas Whitmore had worn a photograph of his dead fiancée to his wedding. Not just worn it, displayed it prominently, making sure it would be captured in the formal portrait. Why? Was it devotion? Guilt? A message? She returned to Dr. Martinez with her findings. Together, they dug deeper into Eleanor Hartwell's death. The police report was brief and perfunctory, but they found witness statements that had been filed but never publicly released. Sarah read them with a growing sense of dread. According to multiple witnesses, Eleanor and Thomas had been arguing at the party. Several people reported hearing Eleanor say something about telling the truth, and Thomas responding with, "You'll destroy everything." Minutes later, Eleanor was found dead in the garden beneath the drawing room window. One witness, a housemaid named Mary Sullivan, gave a statement that was particularly disturbing. She claimed to have been in the hallway outside the drawing room and heard the argument escalate. She heard Eleanor say, "I won't marry someone who lies about what happened to her," and Thomas respond with something Mary couldn't make out. Then there was silence, followed by the sound of the window opening, and then screaming. Mary's statement included one more detail that had been crossed out in the official report but was still legible. "When I ran into the room, Mr. Whitmore was standing by the window looking down. He turned to me and said, 'She fell. You saw her fall, didn't you?' But I didn't see anything, I only heard." "Who was the her that Eleanor mentioned?" Sarah asked Dr. Martinez. "The woman Thomas supposedly lied about?" Dr. Martinez had been searching through older records. "I found something that might be relevant. In 1907, 3 years before Eleanor's death, a young woman named Anna Brennan died. She was Catherine's older sister." Sarah's breath caught. Catherine's sister? How did she die? It's not entirely clear. The death certificate lists the cause as accidental drowning. She was found in the creek that ran through the Whitmore property. Thomas found her body. He handed Sarah a newspaper clipping. There was a brief mention in the paper, but no investigation. Anna was known to have a drinking problem, and it was assumed she'd fallen into the creek while intoxicated. "But Eleanor knew something different," Sarah said slowly. "Something about Anna's death that Thomas had lied about. And when she threatened to reveal the truth, she ended up dead too." "That's one interpretation," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "But we have no proof of any of this. Just hints and suggestions in old documents. The truth died with all of them." But Sarah couldn't let it go. She visited Forest Hill Cemetery in Scranton, where Eleanor Hartwell was buried. The grave was in a quiet corner, shaded by old oak trees. The headstone was simple. Eleanor Margaret Hartwell, 1887–1909, beloved daughter and friend. Someone had left fresh flowers there, which struck Sarah as strange. Eleanor had been dead for 116 years. Who would still be visiting her grave? She asked the cemetery caretaker, an elderly man who'd worked there for 40 years. He looked at her strangely when she mentioned the fresh flowers. "Nobody comes to that grave," he said. "At least, not that I've ever seen. And I would know. I visit every section twice a week." But the flowers were there, white roses, barely wilted. Sarah touched them and felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warm afternoon sun. That night, back in Philadelphia, Sarah had trouble sleeping. She kept seeing the photograph in her mind, Thomas's intense eyes, the pendant around his neck, Catherine's sad expression, and the inscription, "May God forgive us all." Around 3 a.m., she gave up on sleep and returned to Margaret's journals. She'd been reading them chronologically, but now she jumped ahead to the final entries from 1999, the last year Margaret had written before her arthritis became too severe. One entry from December 1999 made her sit up straight in bed. "I went through Mother's things again today, the few items Aunt Helen saved." The photograph is there, the one of Mother and Father from their wedding. I've looked at it 1,000 times, but today I noticed something I'd never seen before. The necklace father is wearing. I used a magnifying glass and looked closely at the face inside. It's not Eleanor Hartwell, as I'd always assumed. The face is younger, with darker hair. It looks like Mother, or rather, it looks like Mother's sister Anna, whose photograph I have in another album. Why would Father be wearing Anna's photograph at his wedding to Mother? Unless... The entry ended there, mid-thought, as if Margaret had been struck by a realization she couldn't bring herself to write down. Sarah returned to Dr. Martinez with Margaret's journal entry. Together they pulled out the photographs of Anna Brennan that were in the Historical Society's collection. Sarah's hands trembled as she compared them to the face in Thomas's pendant, using digital enhancement to clarify the old photograph. Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "They're very similar. Anna and Eleanor looked alike, both fair-haired, similar ages, but if we're right about this, then Thomas had Anna's photograph in his pendant, not Eleanor's," Sarah finished. "Which means his obsession wasn't with his dead fiancée. It was with his wife's dead sister." They spent the next several days piecing together what they could from fragmented records and old newspaper articles. A picture emerged of Thomas Whitmore Jr. as a troubled young man who'd fallen in love with Anna Brennan, the daughter of one of his father's mine managers. But Anna, 7 years older than Catherine, had been deemed unsuitable by the Whitmore family due to her lower social status and her reputation for drinking and erratic behavior. According to one Society column from 1906, Thomas and Anna had been seen together frequently at local events, causing scandal. But by 1907, Thomas was being pushed toward a more appropriate match with Eleanor Hartwell, whose family owned a competing mining operation. The marriage would unite two industrial fortunes. Anna drowned in August 1907. The circumstances were suspicious. She was found in shallow water, barely deep enough to drown in, and there were bruises on her arms. But the investigation was closed quickly, and Thomas married Eleanor 2 years later. "What if Eleanor discovered what really happened to Anna?" Sarah said. "What if she learned that Thomas was involved in her death or knew the truth about it?" Dr. Martinez was hesitant. "We're speculating now, connecting dots that might not be connected." But Sarah pulled out another document she'd found in Margaret's collection, a letter written in Thomas's handwriting, dated March 1910, a month before his wedding to Catherine. It had never been sent, just folded and placed in an envelope marked, "To Catherine, if something happens to me." The letter was long and rambling, clearly written by someone in an agitated state. In it, Thomas confessed his feelings for Anna, describing their secret relationship and his devastation at her death. He wrote about how he'd been forced to marry Eleanor to save his family's business, but how he couldn't stop thinking about Anna. The letter contained one particularly chilling passage. "Eleanor knows what happened that night by the creek. She's known for months, though I can't understand how she discovered it. She says she has evidence, something Anna left behind, something that proves the truth. She's threatened to reveal everything unless I go through with the marriage, saying that at least as my wife she can control me, watch me, prevent me from hurting anyone else the way I hurt Anna. I am trapped, Catherine, trapped by my own sins. If you're reading this, it means something terrible has happened, and you need to know the truth before you agree to marry me. I am not a good man. I am responsible for your sister's death, and I will carry that guilt until my own death." Sarah and Dr. Martinez sat in stunned silence after reading the letter. The document was explosive, a confession to murder, or at least to being responsible for Anna's death. But it raised more questions than it answered. Why had Catherine still married him if she'd known about this letter, and what had happened to Eleanor? "Thomas never sent this letter," Dr. Martinez observed, "which means Catherine might never have known the full truth. Or she knew and married him anyway," Sarah said. "Maybe she thought she could save him, or maybe she felt obligated because she was pregnant." "Pregnant?" Dr. Martinez looked surprised. Sarah pulled out another document, Margaret's birth certificate. Margaret was born in November 1910, but Thomas and Catherine didn't marry until April, which means Catherine was already pregnant when they wed. Maybe that's why she agreed to marry him despite knowing about Anna. The pieces were falling into place, but they created a picture of tragedy rather than clear villainy. Thomas, haunted by his role in Anna's death and his forced marriage to Eleanor. Eleanor, discovering the truth and threatening to expose him. Catherine, pregnant and desperate, agreeing to marry the man responsible for her sister's death and running through it all, the question of what really happened that night when Eleanor fell from the window. Sarah made one final trip to Scranton, this time to visit St. Michael's Church, where Eleanor's funeral had been held. The church was old, built in the 1890s and still in operation. The current pastor, Father James O'Connor, was in his 70s and had been with the church for 40 years. When Sarah explained what she was researching, his expression became grave. "The Whitmore family story is well known in this parish," he said. "My predecessor, Father William, told me about it when I first arrived. He'd been a young priest in 1909, and he'd spoken with Eleanor Hartwell the day before she died." Sarah's heart raced. What did she tell him? Father William never shared the details of their conversation. Confession is sacred, but he did say that Eleanor came to the church in great distress, asking for guidance on what to do when telling the truth might destroy innocent lives. He counseled her to trust in God and do what her conscience demanded. The next day, she was dead. Father O'Connor led Sarah to the church records room and showed her Eleanor's memorial service documents. Tucked inside was a small envelope addressed to "Whoever finds this." Inside was a note in Eleanor's handwriting. "If I should die unexpectedly, please know that I loved Thomas Whitmore and I wanted to save him from himself. He is not evil, only weak." Anna Brennan's death was an accident. They argued by the creek and she fell when he tried to stop her from leaving. But he was too afraid to tell the truth, too afraid of his father and what would happen to his family's reputation. "I thought that by marrying him, I could help him find redemption, but he's planning something terrible. I can see it in his eyes. He's asked me to meet him alone in the drawing room tonight. I'm afraid, but I must go. If I don't return, please tell Catherine Brennan that her sister's death was not her fault and that she should never marry Thomas Whitmore. He destroys everything he touches." Sarah read the note 3 times, her hands shaking. Eleanor had known she was in danger. She'd gone to meet Thomas anyway, hoping to save him, and she died for it. "This should have gone to the police," Sarah said. Father O'Connor nodded sadly. Father William struggled with that question for years, but Eleanor had left the note here, in the church, not at the police station. He believed she wanted God to decide when the truth should come out, and perhaps God is deciding now, through you. Back in Philadelphia, Sarah arranged all her findings on her apartment wall like a detective investigating a crime. Photographs, documents, letters, and journal entries created a timeline of tragedy spanning from 1907 to 1915. But despite all the evidence she'd gathered, she couldn't definitively answer the central question. Did Thomas Whitmore murder Eleanor Hartwell, or did she fall accidentally during their confrontation? The evidence pointed in both directions. Eleanor's note suggested she believed Thomas was planning something terrible, yet her death was ruled accidental. Witnesses heard arguing but didn't see the fall. Mary Sullivan's statement suggested Thomas had been standing by the window after Eleanor fell, but that didn't prove he'd pushed her. And then there was the pendant, Anna's photograph that Thomas wore to his wedding with Catherine. Was it devotion to a lost love? Guilt over her death, or something darker, a trophy, a reminder of what he'd gotten away with? Sarah sat down with the original photograph one last time, studying every detail under bright light. Thomas's intense eyes staring at the camera. Catherine's sad, resigned expression, the pendant clearly visible around his neck. And on the back, the inscription that had started it all. "May God forgive us all." Who had written that inscription? Catherine, who married the man responsible for her sister's death. Thomas in a moment of guilt and despair, or Margaret years later after discovering the truth about her family? Sarah's phone rang. It was an unknown number from the Scranton area code. She answered hesitantly. "Is this Sarah Chen?" a woman's voice asked. "I heard you've been researching the Whitmore family." "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Helen Whitmore. I'm Thomas Whitmore's great-grandniece. I understand you found some items that belonged to Margaret Holloway?" Sarah's heart pounded. "Yes, I purchased items from her estate. How did you know?" "Small community. Word gets around when someone starts digging into old family history." Helen paused. "I think we should meet. There are things about the Whitmore family that aren't in any documents." They arranged to meet the following day at a coffee shop in Scranton. Helen Whitmore turned out to be in her early 70s, elegantly dressed, with sharp eyes that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of Thomas's intense gaze in the photograph. "My grandfather was Thomas's younger brother," Helen explained over coffee. "He rarely spoke about Thomas, but once, when he was very old and dying, he told me something. He said that Thomas didn't kill Eleanor Hartwell or Anna Brennan, but that he might as well have, because his weakness and cowardice killed them just as surely as if he'd pushed them himself." "What did he mean?" Helen wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Anna's death was an accident, just as Eleanor suspected. Thomas and Anna had been secretly engaged, but Thomas's father found out and threatened to disinherit him and destroy Anna's family. Her father would lose his job, and the family would be evicted from company housing. Thomas broke off the engagement. Anna was devastated. She started drinking heavily. The night she died, she went to Thomas and begged him to run away with her. He refused. They argued. She ran off toward the creek, drunk and heartbroken. He followed, trying to stop her, but she fell and hit her head on rocks. By the time Thomas pulled her out, she was dead. Why didn't he tell anyone? He panicked. He was afraid of his father, afraid of what people would think. So he left her body there and pretended to find her the next morning. He let everyone believe she drunkenly wandered into the creek alone. Sarah felt sick. And Eleanor. Eleanor was in love with Thomas. She wanted to help him, to save him from his guilt. But she discovered the truth about Anna, I don't know how. When she confronted Thomas, she told him she knew what really happened and that she would help him confess and find peace. But Thomas's father got wind of the situation. He met with Eleanor privately and threatened her family. He told her that if she revealed anything about Anna's death, he would destroy the Hartwells financially. So Eleanor agreed to marry Thomas, thinking she could contain the situation and help him from within the marriage. But something went wrong, Sarah said. Helen nodded grimly. The night of the party, Eleanor told Thomas she couldn't go through with the marriage after all. She said she'd rather be poor than be complicit in a cover-up. Thomas's father was at the party. When he realized what was happening, he went to the drawing room to confront Eleanor. Thomas followed. What happened next? Helen trailed off. My grandfather said there were 3 people in that room when Eleanor fell. Thomas, his father, and Eleanor. Afterward, there were only 2. Are you saying Thomas's father pushed her? I'm saying that's what my grandfather believed. Thomas was standing frozen in shock while his father leaned out the window and called for help, already concocting the story they would tell. Thomas went along with it because he didn't know what else to do. He was weak, always weak. And the pendant? Why did Thomas wear Anna's photograph? Helen reached into her purse and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. When she unwrapped it, Sarah gasped. It was the pendant from the photograph. The same silver chain, the same ornate locket, but without any photograph inside. This has been in our family for generations, Helen said. Thomas made a will before he killed himself in 1915. He left specific instructions that the pendant be given to Margaret when she turned 21, along with a letter explaining everything. But Catherine's sister, Margaret's aunt, destroyed the letter. She thought it would only cause more pain. The pendant passed through the family empty. We never knew whose photograph had been inside it, until now. Sarah felt the weight of history pressing down on her. So Thomas wore Anna's photograph to his wedding with Catherine as a form of penance or confession? I think it was his way of telling Catherine the truth without speaking it aloud. He knew she'd see the photograph eventually, understand whose face it was. Maybe he hoped she'd call off the wedding, but she didn't. She went through with it even though she knew, because she was pregnant, because she had no other choice, because the world didn't give women many options in 1910. Helen stood to leave, but paused. My grandfather said that Thomas's last words, before he pulled the trigger, were, "I'm sorry." But he never specified who he was apologizing to. Was it Anna, Eleanor, Catherine, Margaret? All of them? She placed the pendant on the table between them. "Keep this. It belongs with the photograph. Maybe together they'll tell the story better than either of us can." After Helen left, Sarah sat alone with the pendant and the photograph, turning them over in her hands. She had all the pieces now, or as many as still existed. But instead of providing closure, the complete story only raised more questions. Did Thomas's father push Eleanor, or did she fall during an argument? Was Thomas complicit in her death, or just guilty of weakness and cowardice? Did Catherine know the full truth when she married Thomas, or only part of it? And what about Margaret? Did she ever learn the dark history of the photograph she kept her entire life? That night, Sarah had a dream. She was standing in a drawing room filled with people in Edwardian dress. She saw Thomas, young and haunted, standing by a window. Catherine sat in a chair, her hand resting on her stomach where their child grew. And she saw two other women, one with fair hair who looked like Eleanor, and one with darker hair who looked like Anna. They stood on either side of Thomas, not touching him, but close enough that he seemed caught between them. In the dream, Sarah asked Thomas what really happened, but he just looked at her with those intense eyes from the photograph and said, "What difference does it make now? We're all dead. The truth died with us." Sarah woke up with tears on her face. She lay in the darkness, thinking about the photograph, about all the lives it represented, and all the pain it captured in a single frozen moment. In the morning, she carefully packaged the photograph and the pendant together, along with all her research, and donated them to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. She included a note. "This collection represents the Whitmore family tragedy of 1907-1915. Despite extensive research, many questions remain unanswered. Perhaps someday someone will discover the definitive truth. Until then, these items stand as a reminder that every old photograph tells a story, and sometimes those stories are darker than we can imagine." 3 months later, Sarah received a letter from the Historical Society. They'd placed the photograph and pendant on display as part of an exhibit on Edwardian-era Pennsylvania. The exhibit was popular, but several visitors reported feeling uncomfortable when looking at the photograph. One woman said she felt like Thomas was watching her. Another claimed she heard someone crying when she stood in front of the display case. The museum staff dismissed these reports as overactive imaginations, but Sarah knew better. She'd lived with that photograph for months, studied it for hours, and she'd felt it too, the sense that something unresolved lingered around it, some truth that refused to stay buried. Sometimes, late at night in her apartment, Sarah would think about the inscription on the back of the photograph, "May God forgive us all." She'd think about Thomas wearing Anna's photograph to his wedding, about Eleanor going to meet her death trying to save someone who couldn't be saved, about Catherine marrying a man she knew was responsible for her sister's death, about Margaret growing up in the shadow of tragedies she never fully understood, and she'd wonder, in the end, did God forgive them? Did they forgive themselves? Or are some sins too great to be washed away, even by time? The photograph still exists, displayed in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Visitors can see it any day of the week. Thomas and Catherine Whitmore, frozen in 1910, their faces composed, their secrets hidden behind sepia tones and formal poses. The pendant is clearly visible around Thomas's neck, but the face inside it remains unclear. Deliberately so, perhaps. Some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious. If you visit the exhibit, you might stand in front of that photograph and feel what Sarah felt, what other visitors have reported feeling, a sense of unease, of watching eyes, of stories that refuse to stay silent. You might look at Thomas's intense gaze and wonder what he was thinking as he posed for that photograph, wearing his guilt around his neck. You might look at Catherine's sad eyes and wonder what she knew, what she sacrificed, what she lived with every day of her brief marriage. Or you might just see an old photograph, a historical curiosity, a glimpse into a long-dead world. The truth, as always, depends on what you choose to believe. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and answer any questions. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next mystery.